For our second session, Dr. Jerry Dobson has assembled a group of leading experts on a topic that is often considered the poster problem of climate change, sea level rise. Even if you don't live near a coast, everyone has heard about this issue, but there is a lot of misinformation surrounding it. Today, we hope to give some clarity and find out what the facts really are. Jerry, welcome to you and your panel.
Thank you, John. Our panel today, let me go back to this slide. We decided at the council that we wanted a clear example. We wanted something within the broader spectrum of environmental and global change that people accept mostly. And so we decided to focus on sea level rise. Then we decided we wanted to talk about probabilities, predictions, probabilities. We wanted to speak about impacts, both physical and human, and we wanted to deal with the questions of insurance, mitigation, and finance. Then we went looking for the best people to speak on those subjects. We picked Jerry Mitrovica from Harvard as our first speaker, Radley Horton as our second speaker, and Roger Greiner as our third speaker. And I believe you will find them all very capable of dealing with these questions. This is a point that I have made at every previous Geography 2050 that I have attended, which is most of them, and that is that our relationship with Columbia University goes way back. So you see, if you look across the quad here, you will see the Seth Low Library. He was the president of Columbia University and at the same time was president of the American Geographical Society. And a year later, he became mayor of the new consolidated city of New York. I'm just going to say a couple of words from my own experience. I worked for 18 years with the NOAA. I was at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, but I was funded by NOAA to work on the Coastal Change Analysis Program. We never thought of that as a sea level rise program. It was for fisheries and environmental concerns. But one thing I learned from it is that vegetation is the best indicator. It's the best sensor you will ever have for understanding where sea level rise change is occurring. And the only thing you have to work out in addition to that is the land rising or the water falling, rising. This graph, I've devoted more than 2 decades working with the problem of sea level rise. And I've looked back, I haven't done anything of projections to the future. What I've been looking at is what sea level rise has already occurred, and it's a phenomenal amount. Sea level has risen 125, 130 meters since 20,000 years ago. And if you look at this graph, you see a very clear pattern here, and that is that the highest points sea level has been are 140,000 years ago and today. And that line across there shows that for 105,000 years, the sea level has not gone below 25 meters below today's sea level. Excuse me, not had gone above that. That means that what we're seeing today is not the normal. The normal was 25 below. At 60,000 years ago, it had never been, it had never been closer to today's sea level than 68 meters over 60,000 years, over 35,000 years at 85 meters below, and over 12,000 years at over 100 meters. And then it jumps very quickly, and what we're talking about now is what happens to that end of the asymptotic curve at the forward end of it. This is the greatest scientific clue regarding human origins, evolution, and cultural development. We'd never named it. I named it Aquaterra, suggested that name, and it's caught in some places. This is the distribution of Aquaterra, the lands that were inundated in the last 20,000 years. Equivalent to South America in size globally, entirely flat, entirely coastal, and mostly tropical, therefore the best place to live during the ice ages. Another thing we discovered most recently is that where you see the Bering Sea today, from 30,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago, there were scores of islands there. There's no sign of them today, but the isostatic adjustments of the seafloor created those islands, and they make a very good stepping stone pathway for the first Americans coming across. I found that people have a hard time, we know as geographers, they have a hard time thinking in two dimensions. If you start adding a third dimension to it, and then you add time to that, people have a very hard time understanding it. And now the vagaries of culture and so forth. My brother and I got together and wrote two novels, one about the modern search for it, and one about people actually living in that time. So I'm going to stop right there and turn to our first speaker, Jerry Mitrovica.
Thanks.
Mitrovica.
That's to go. Okay, well, thank you. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to stand up. Sure. It just feels unusual sitting with the visuals behind me. Well, hello, everyone. I'm going to try to give you a sense today of how studies of sea level change in a progressively warming world have advanced over the last 20 years or so. They've advanced because of a vast improvement in our understanding of the processes that contribute to that sea level change. I'll start with this. This is a very simple diagram. It shows global mean sea level here, that's on the y-axis, over the last 150 years. As predicted by a number of papers. I was on one of these papers, the Hay et al. Paper there. She was my graduate student. That paper used what you might call advanced statistical techniques to estimate that sea level rise in the 20th century had gone up on average about 1.2 millimeters per year. That's about an inch every 20 years. And that's a consensus viewpoint. There's no disagreement there. So now let's look at the box over there on the right here. That is in the last 20 years. Data, in this case, from satellite records. In the last figure, it was from both satellite and land-based records. But in the last 20 years, satellite records provide an unambiguous estimate of sea level rise in the 3 to 4 millimeter per year range. That's an inch every 6 years, or a factor of 3 to 4 greater rate than in the 20th century. Now, we can even go further than that, right? We can start projecting. This is a figure taken from the assessment report, the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's an attempt here to project sea level to the end of the current century. On the right there, the SSPs, these are just shared socioeconomic pathways, doesn't really matter. The bottom one represents a very low emission green economy. The top one is a high emission scenario. That range suggests that sea level rise, global average sea level rise in the next 80 years, will reach levels about 0.5 meter to 1 meter above pre-industrial levels of the sea. The sort of rogue line at the top there represents a test case where a number of hypothesized ice sheet instability processes have been added to the stew in a high emission scenario. Okay, well, let me change the narrative now, because that's global mean sea level. If you're in a community that was worried about sea level hazard, global mean sea level rise doesn't really have any impact on you. What you want to know is, what is the sea level going to be like? How is sea level going to change in your backyard? And in the 20 years that I've been particularly active in this sort of research, it has been shown that the geographic variability in sea level is extreme, and I'm going to run you through that. There's a number of processes here. I think this is also ultimately taken from the IPCC report. Sea levels change because of melting glaciers and ice sheets, changes because of changes in ocean circulation, thermal expansion, warming of the ocean, and also the hydrological cycle, the mass flux from continents to oceans and back. Each and every one of these processes produces a dramatic geographic imprint on sea level. This is an example of that. This is an image taken from satellite data of sea level change in the last 22 years. You can see here that there have been areas of extreme sea level rise. There's even been areas where sea level has fallen over that period. The Earth is not a bathtub, and it has been important in recent work to understand that more fully. So, a lot of you are teachers. I'm a teacher. I'm going to give you a pop quiz. I'm going to pay you back. All those students who want to give you a pop quiz, I'm giving you one now. What would happen on Long Island Sound if the Greenland ice sheet melted sufficiently to raise the average of global sea level 5 meters? That's essentially a full collapse of the Greenland ice sheet. What would we experience just off there on Long Island Sound, near my sister who lives in Queens? Sea level would only rise by about 2.5 meters in that case. Right? But let's go to another. Now let's take that melt and originate it from the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is considered to be perhaps the most unstable of the cryosphere. What would happen if it melted enough, and this would require full collapse, to raise global average sea level 5 meters in that case? What would we see in Long Island Sound? 6.5 meters. Almost a factor of 3 difference between those two. Why is that? What's going on there? I'm going to show you it's just Newton sitting under the apple tree. Okay? What happens when any ice sheet or glacier collapses? What happens are 3 things. The dashed lines there represent before melt. Red lines on the right there represent after melt. 3 things happen when you melt an ice sheet or glacier. One is you are no doubt dumping meltwater into the ocean. You are increasing the mass of the ocean. But close to the ice sheet, other things happen. The first is that the land, which is now unloaded because the ice sheet melts, pops up. The third thing is that the gravitational attraction that ice sheet exerts on the water decreases at its melt, and water migrates away. That's the dashed to red line. So this is probably the most counterintuitive fact in global climate change. Sea level near a melting ice sheet falls, and it falls dramatically. But you pay a price progressively further away. That water migrates somewhere, and it migrates progressively more towards the far field of those ice sheets. So let me show you an actual simulation now. This is a simulation where we just shaved off the Greenland ice sheet enough to raise average sea level now 1 meter. If this was a bathtub world, if this was, it is forcing me forward. Can we go backward? Hello? One more. Okay. That red zone there is the region in which sea level would fall, not rise. How close is close? It's 2,000 kilometers. It's not very close. If you had a friend who lived in Scotland and you knew that the Greenland ice sheet was going to catastrophically collapse, that person would be justifiably concerned, but they should be concerned if the Greenland ice sheet catastrophically collapses, but in their backyard, sea level will actually fall. If you have a home in Tierra del Fuego, you're in a bit of trouble because sea level rise there will be 40% more than the average. These are large effects. The sea level fall that you would experience in Iceland, for example, close to Greenland, would be about 5 to 7 meters of sea level fall. Okay? So let's go on. The bottom here is now the same kind of calculation done by melting 1 meter of equivalent global average sea level rise from the West Antarctic. Here, the red zone surrounds the West Antarctic, and sea level rises by progressive amounts as you move further away from that ice sheet. Right? When we published this figure about 10 years ago, the editors asked us to be very careful. And you know why? Because the maximum sea level rise that you would experience by the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet is very close to Washington, D.C. You don't want to get that calculation wrong. So here we are. We look at this calculation now. We interrogate pictures like this to try to understand what all the components of sea level change, what are those processes? How much are they contributing? The last figure I showed you showed that the geometries of sea level rise when Greenland melts or when West Antarctic melts are very distinct. All of these geometries have become known as sea level fingerprints for an obvious reason. So the goal of research now in 2023 isn't to tell you what global mean sea level change is going to be. It is an attempt to tell you, here are the contributors, here's what we know about them, here's what they're evolving, and here's what you can find in your backyard. This is another example of such a fingerprint. It's one of those processes. I spent no time on it. I actually have focused mainly on sea level in response to melting ice sheets, but there are experts who look at how land subsidence, that Dr. Dobson mentioned briefly, also contributes to sea level rise. Okay, I'm just going to flip through that and get to this. So I'm on a proposal that has been funded by a new institute at Harvard, the Salate Institute, where we are looking at sea level rise that is being experienced and will be experienced in West Africa along the Gulf of Guinea. This is a picture taken in Ghana as part of that. Okay. It is a truism, isn't it? We heard it in the last group talking about climate justice, that the most vulnerable communities in sea level rise are those that are responsible for the least amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So I would put to you that our responsibility of scientists in sea level is to understand this physics better and better and better. So those projections that I talked to you about will become more accurate, more precise. And the projections aren't just of global mean sea level, but rather of sea level globally. What is the global geometry we're about to face? Right? We owe people here, in a visit to this area, it becomes clear that we owe people here to understand that the damage that we are doing to their climate, to understand that very well indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oops, sorry. Thank you.
Hard to go back.
This one's forward?
Yeah, just this one, but it only goes forward.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. It's great to have a chance to speak with you today. Let's see. Where do I, there we go. Okay. I think it skipped a slide, but that's all right. So yeah, my name's Radley. I'm a professor here at Columbia University. Thrilled to have the chance to speak with you. I'm going to sort of serve a role to try to pivot us a little bit from thinking about the global and regional hazards of sea level rise to thinking about the higher frequency extreme events, that hazard component, but also thinking a little bit about broader risk impact issues. Okay, and this is basically, in a nutshell, my thinking about climate risk today. So I just want to take a minute to sort of walk through how I'm thinking about these things. The analogy I like to use is we're on a shoreline, and if we look out at the ocean, we're basically seeing two waves coming our way. The first wave I tend to describe as the semi-linear sort of thinking about climate change. These are the hazards that we've been increasingly understanding through the IPCC and other processes for the last decade or more. We're still far from being all the way there in terms of knowing how to respond, but we think we sort of understand what's coming towards us in that first wave. And I think what's cause of a lot of pessimism and is concerning is this growing sense that there could be a second wave further offshore that's coming towards us, that we still are seeing growing evidence that it's there, but it's very hard to quantify, and arguably so complex that we'll never be able to fully quantify just how big that wave is. This is the wave of nonlinear impacts in the climate system. This is the wave of compound extremes within the climate system, but also ways that you can have correlation between physical hazards and, say, human vulnerabilities, like we heard about in the last panel. It's a world of complexity where, while to first order, you absolutely want to know, is your home, is your asset going to be underwater? But with the second wave, arguably it's more important to know all the indirect ways that loss of insurance, changes in risk perception, changes in the very sort of feasibility of continuing to have a tax base that can fund infrastructure in a place, become the dominant narratives, even more than that sort of physical understanding of exactly where the water is going to go or exactly how hot it's going to get in a given place. So fortunately, there's a third wave, which in my sort of tortured metaphor is a wave coming from the shore. If we turn the other way, this is the wave of climate solutions. This is the wave of rapid uptake of emissions reductions. This is the wave of adaptation to all these coastal threats for cities like New York, for vulnerable communities all over the world, and doing it in a way where we also engage the issues of justice that we heard so much about in this last panel. So that's the really high-level frame. I'm mostly going to talk about the second part, but I do want to walk through that first sort of linear wave quickly, too, because it's so fundamental, just going sort of one step past where Jerry took us. So this slide from the last National Climate Assessment is basically telling you, the takeaway on this slide is a little bit of sea level rise profoundly changes the frequency and intensity of coastal flood events. So let's walk through it a little bit. The figure on the left is only historical data. It's basically showing you for a whole bunch of coastal locations all across the US, as we move forward from the last 2 generations, how frequently are each of these places experiencing what's referred to as nuisance flooding? These are the types of events that make it impossible to travel along your coastal road. These are the kind of events that flood basements, make it so you might not be able to open your business when it happens. When they're occurring once per year, a couple times per year, during maybe sort of nuisance high flood events, they're somewhat manageable for most people. The challenge is that already, just with the relatively small amount of sea level rise we've seen so far, right? Remember Jerry's graphs of what we've seen to date. Already, that little bit of sea level rise alone means that a lot of these places are now experiencing high water levels once a week that used to happen 2 generations ago a few times a year. And that's sea level rise, combined in some places with a little bit of that land subsidence that Jerry mentioned. Okay, now if we pivot to the image on the right, it's telling a little different story. Here, instead of talking about those sort of nuisance, difficult to manage events, we're talking about the catastrophic, game-changing flood events. These are the 1 in 100-year high water levels that determine whether you can get insurance, whether zoning allows you to build in a place, and obviously is hugely impactful for life. So this is also a projection on the right, but it's a projection, it's a conservative projection of sea level rise. Something like 2 feet of sea level rise this century, which from my perspective, we'd be fairly lucky if we only get a couple feet. The image on the right makes no assumptions about stronger hurricanes, stronger nor'easters. It's just the storms of the past with a relatively small amount of sea level rise. And it's showing you a transformative effect on the frequency of coastal flooding. The colors are showing you how often you're going to be getting those events that locally were associated with a 1 in 100-year high water level. So for New York City, it's roughly the height of Hurricane Sandy's surge. Look at all the places there where you see reds. Those are places where every couple years, under a close to best case scenario for sea level rise, and without invoking stronger hurricanes or anything like that, events that used to happen once a year are happening once every few years. Don't worry about the precise numbers. There's a huge amount of uncertainty, but the takeaway in the precision. But anywhere you look, in the lifetime of the typical home mortgage, you're basically going to be seeing what used to be, this game-changing high water level. This is the linear story of climate change. This is something that's essentially baked in. Certain places will be able to adapt, seawalls, things like that, but this is the linear sort of take. And certainly we can directly sort of project what a lot of these types of impacts are on society, right? Direct loss of life. As you have that higher sea level, wave action can penetrate further inland. Water can move more quickly, which is directly linked to the risk of people losing their life when a storm surge coincides with whatever the baseline sea level is, right? Loss of livelihood, as we see the sort of impacts on communities after these events. Clearly, you're going to have the direct physical damage to the built environment, buildings, for example, from that moving water, from that waves. But also we have to think about the effects that salt water have in terms of corroding critical infrastructure. What happens to wastewater treatment plants and their ability to function when they get inundated with water. Just having that higher sea level means the intensity when those events happen is that much greater. We heard a little bit of an allusion earlier to the ecological impacts, right? There are parts of New York City where you've seen the trees dying as an effect of that saltwater intrusion during previous events. And linking back again to some of the environmental justice points around pollution and water quality. So many brownfields, right? Former industrial sites, often located very near the coast. Even if storms don't get stronger, just that higher baseline sea level means more of that could get activated in those sites. And the effects on water quality, everything from more salt getting into water to higher water tables, meaning that in a lot of parts of the country where maybe you have former gas stations, a little bit of fuel, that stuff can sort of make its way more easily into the water table. So this still is like the linear story. Now, into the remaining time, let's pivot a little bit and talk about the sort of emerging science and sort of risk perception, because we can't think about these events in isolation. So just to sort of talk a little bit about this framing, one way to think about it is compound extreme events and multi-hazards. So if you're an insurer or a reinsurer, if you are an emergency management responder, climate change is making it clearer and clearer that you can't just plan for that one event. You have to be thinking about what's the risk of a sequence. This was an individual day in 2019. You see with all these powerful and devastating hurricanes. As we have sea level rise, there's a greater risk for major storm surge in multiple places. So how do we think about those risks? How do we protect the most vulnerable populations? And is any of the kind of financial modeling that anyone is doing able to think about the complex sort of knockoff effects that frankly could break the bank sooner than later on various types of reinsurance, financial modeling. And if the past is precedent, a lot of our vulnerable communities are going to be at the greatest risk. Just quickly, what some of these ways, there's these categories of thinking about compound extremes. Multivariate is the idea that you're going to have storm surge at the same time that you have heavy rain, often during a hurricane. Sea level rise not only makes that storm surge go further inland, but it means that if it's raining at the same time, it's going to be harder for that rainwater to drain out, right? That gradual increase in sea level can introduce newer, stronger correlations among those variables during the same storm. It also increases the risk that when a hurricane comes, for example, the power will get knocked out in certain places. Transformers, for example, that are a little above the flood zone. And with more heat waves in the future, you start to ask, just how much are the odds going up of the power being out due to a storm precisely when that heat wave comes and you most need that power to provide air conditioning, especially for our most vulnerable communities. Okay? So this indirect impacts world, like this is inherently hand-wavy, right? It's very hard to quantify this stuff. But I think you can make the case that as we see more of these extreme events, as we turn up the dial on climate change, there's key processes that are starting to emerge that are missing from climate models, missing from financial and risk models as well. And we need to talk about them in a qualitative way, and we need to be very wary of false precision. Any claim that we can know exactly whether a building is going to be underwater or not at a given year, that to first order, that's critical information. We'll be much better off as society if we try to plan for that sort of thing, but it's just the first half of the narrative. And ultimately, when we think about property values and the need to move, a lot of these complex second order effects are going to be the dominant terms, although they initially are going to be driven by things like, is your home relatively at risk or not to floods, right? So, but there is this potential for very disorderly, hard to predict shifts in asset values. Changes in insurability, right, as we're seeing often happen at a statewide level, right? It's not always happening at the building level. Even if you're in a city, maybe where you're not in an area that's prone to flooding, what happens, how does the tax base affect it if other parts of the city do see big losses in asset values? What happens to the ability to sort of fund, bonds, critical infrastructure investments that are especially critical for maybe some of the vulnerable communities in these cities? These are some of the ways that everybody gets affected within a city, nationally, globally, by these emerging risks. Will employers start to move out of some of these areas and move into other areas? So those are just some of the dimensions. I think in the interest of time, I'll just quickly show a couple more slides. This is, of course, connected to these emerging conversations about migration and movement, for example, within the US. This is a slide courtesy of Alex DeSherban in here. Just sort of showing how climate is beginning to become part of the conversation when people are thinking about whether they'll move or not. This is a perfect example of something that is related to how high the sea level is, how often storm surge is happening, but arguably the intricacy, the complexity, the real drivers on where opportunities are going to be in prices is in this type of very hard to quantify information more than it's in, say, knowing exactly how high the water levels are going to be. Another aspect of this sort of correlation and compounding, we heard earlier about how the same communities that are vulnerable to climate risks also are exposed to all these other hazards, right? Suffer the most during COVID, for example. It's not a coincidence, right? It's this deep-seated racist history in many cases, history of inequality and injustice. So when we're thinking about adaptations to sea level rise and storm surge, we need to think about things like that image at bottom right, which shows people trying to evacuate in advance of a hurricane, right? How do you do an evacuation during a pandemic? How do we manage against those same communities that are vulnerable to both COVID and in particular in need of being helped evacuating? So how do you manage these kind of compound risks so that those vulnerable communities aren't suffering the most is a huge challenge. And I think I'm probably just about at time here, but I do want to briefly allude to this third wave, a wave where I think we really can arguably still have a lot of optimism, because I talked about these sort of nonlinear, like frightening surprises, but there's also huge potential for upscaling as a social species towards more ambitious emissions reduction, more ambitious adaptation in a way that focuses on justice too. But it won't happen on its own, right? When we're thinking about where to site renewables, we need to think about the emerging climate hazards. When we're thinking about building storm surge barriers, we have to think about the emissions that are going to be associated with all that concrete, for example, too. And justice has to be central to all these conversations as well. So another really hard piece to predict is all of these coastal cities, almost all of them are seeing, not all, but almost all are seeing these growing risks. But how will comparative advantages play out? Will some cities, because they're willing to talk about climate risk, because their geography supports the possibility of barriers, because storm surge barriers, because they have enough money, will they actually in the short term experience competitive advantages relative to other places? These are the kind of really complex things that are very hard to model. And overall, given all these threats, all these challenges, how quickly coastal flooding increases in frequency with just a little sea level rise, given all these underappreciated vulnerabilities in our financial system and affecting vulnerable communities, how do we make sure we don't lose control of this narrative? How do we stay ahead of it? How do we stay optimistic? One of the ways, I think, is coupling our thinking about emissions reduction with resilience and with justice. And the kind of initiatives we heard about at the last panel, I think, point to a way. It's just a start, but the more we sort of hear young people saying, we want to work for the companies that are committed to reducing emissions, that are committed to protecting their workers, protecting their supply chains, those are the kind of narratives that can aggregate and lead to that positive third wave. And then the final sort of small point, but I think is very important, is I think one aspect of this third wave in the nonlinear solutions is striking a balance where we aim for quantitative predictions about hazard and risk. We're in so much of a better place if we plan based on that information rather than assuming for some climate of the past that, have we seen, is not going to happen and we're not adapted to. But how do we become more nuanced and say, we're going for a little more precision, but we know there's never going to be precision. We know at the end of the day, it's these complex ways that society interacts and that we can shape that are ultimately going to determine whether that third wave, that optimistic wave, is big enough to sort of be the dominant wave amidst the other kind of pessimism. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Just call up my slide here. Oops. Okay, that's good. So I know what you're thinking. This is a big problem. How are we going to pay for all of this? So what I hope to do is not give you the answer to that question, but provide a kind of an overview of the finance and insurance kind of systems that are in place and how they work today, and how, particularly the role of insurance. But then also, these will generally apply across all types of climate change and climate adaptation, but I'll give you some context specific to sea level rise. And I think some of the themes that we talk about here will come up again later on in this conference. So let me get started. So who's Verisk? I'll just be very brief. So we are an insurance data and analytics company. We've been around for about 50 plus years now. Started as kind of an insurance data clearinghouse, and we've since evolved to do predictive modeling, analytical insights. We built software technologies. We're focused primarily in insurance. So that includes things like underwriting and rating, claims, property estimating. And the area that I'm focused on is that last bullet there, catastrophe and extreme event modeling. So that's the catastrophe models that Todd was talking about earlier. We also work with governments, NGOs, and banks, but often in kind of a risk transfer capacity. So that's who we are. I guess it's fair to say there's climate change adaptation, sea level rise adaptation is really a whole of society problem, and so will require kind of a whole of society set of solutions. And so when you look across the landscape of all of the sort of options for climate adaptation, you really see the list that I've shown here. So you've got obviously government grants and funding. Those will take various national funding, could be state and local funding. They'll take various types of mechanisms. Some will be dedicated for climate resilience. Some will be part of existing programs. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act has some dedicated funding for climate adaptation, but then there are existing programs like within FEMA, the BRIC and the FMA programs that are intended for resilience investments that will have a climate component. And then there'll also be just the sort of the general financing that municipalities use in terms of bonds for either project-based funding, for example, for roads and highways, as well as the general obligation bonds that they use to sort of run their services. So those will all continue and just be with a climate lens. There are public-private partnerships. These can take various forms, but basically it's where you have a public entity working with a private entities to produce some sort of public good. And those can be very sort of specific, like a design, build, and operate, where a government might fund the construction of a toll road, and then a private company will design and build and operate that toll road. In other cases, it could be a financial arrangement where there's something like the National Flood Insurance Program is in some ways a public-private partnership where the federal government is providing the funding for the claims on the capital, but the program is effectively administered by private insurance companies. So the public-private partnerships provide access to capital and provide access to expertise. And then a few others that I've listed there. So there's climate funds. There are, outside the US in particular, you have philanthropic and nonprofit organizations. And then there are international aid and development organizations, typically outside of the US. And I'm sorry, the formatting here get a little bit squirrely, but those would include things like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, that will fund resilience projects outside of the U.S. generally. So there's a whole host of examples here. I've just picked a few. So there are some federal government-focused examples. Certain states, Florida has a resilient grant program in Florida. California has some. And then there's local projects like here in New York City, parts of the Caribbean, and just general funds that provide access to capital. So again, as I said, it's a whole of society response to a whole society problem. So an idealized risk management period, this is where we get into what's the role of insurance. In general, there will be three kind of reactions that you'll have to risk management. And this is sort of an idealized example. So typically what we want to do is spend most of our time avoiding risk, right? Keep people and property out of harm's way. And that's really where we should be putting really most of our effort. What risk we can't avoid, we want to reduce, right? So things like infrastructure, better building codes. And then the last line of defense is what we call risk transfer. So that's really where the insurance industry comes in. So I say insurance as well as allocated, what I call allocated public reserves, which is where there'll be certainly some risks that are non-insurable, but a public funding could come in and cover those risks. It's most effective when that's done intentionally, where there's some planning and budgeting specifically for that purpose. I say it's an idealized risk management period because that's typically not the way it works, but that's just kind of the idealized goal. Okay, so what's risk transfer? So Todd talked a little bit about this earlier when he talked about this basic idea of insurance where you have risk transfer from he was using the example of shipping, but from individuals and businesses buying an insurance policy from an insurer. That's a form of risk transfer. The insurer will then transfer their risk, portfolios of risk, to the reinsurance industry. That's another form of risk transfer. And so this basic process has been in place for hundreds of years. What's more recent and worth noting is this, what we call the retrocession market. So that is where instead of going to a reinsurer, an insurer can actually access the capital markets. And that's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, the capital markets are roughly an order of magnitude or more the size of the insurance market. So it's a much bigger pool of funding. So that's important. So in other words, the capital markets are comfortable getting access, have enough capital to cover this risk, and they're also comfortable with insurance risk through this mechanism. So that's actually a good thing for green finance and resilience funding, because through this sort of retrocession market, the capital markets have developed some expertise and level of comfort with climate and weather risks. So that's an important consideration, given that it's so much larger than the reinsurance market. So that's potentially good news as we go forward, that if there are projects that can be funded, there's a pool of capital there that could potentially be brought to bear, again, as risk transfer. So what is the role of insurance? Well, really, the role of insurance is measuring risk, mitigating risk, and managing risk. And in the climate science, when we talk about mitigation, we're generally talking about greenhouse gas reductions. In the insurance space, mitigation generally means risk reduction. So that's the term we use. But in terms of measuring, building risk models, developing risk maps, doing claims analytics, scenario modeling, that's the kind of thing that insurers have expertise in. Mitigating, insurers actually fund a lot of research around risk reduction. There's an Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety that does a lot of research on building codes and on building materials. And the insurers can also offer things like premium discounts for mitigation activities. And then finally, managing risk. So the insurance market has a very important role to play in terms of sending a price signal for what are risky activities, what are risky places to live and work and build. And that's an important role that the insurance company, the insurance industry plays, because it can also drive risk-aware behavior and put a cost associated with things like land use planning and so on. And as I've just described, we also connect risk. Sources of risk to sources of capital is an important role for the insurance industry. And finally, I'll just say that there are some future innovations in insurance. So most of the insurance that you buy today is done on an indemnity basis. So in other words, you have a claim, you present a claim to your insurance company and they indemnify you for the cost of that claim, there are new ideas within the insurance industry, things like parametric insurance, and this is actually interesting for this group here. With the advent of sensors and better remote sensing technology, you can actually structure reinsurance or insurance programs, or even reinsurance programs actually, that pay not on the indemnified loss, but actually on the occurrence of the event. So for example, ground motion from an earthquake in a particular box can be used as a way to pay out an insurance product. So that's one example of parametric insurance. Community-based insurance, so particularly for sea level rise and flood in general, there's a huge what we call protection gap. Very little of that risk is actually insured globally, and in the US, very little of it is insured in the private market. It's mostly insured, if it's insured at all, by the National Flood Insurance Program. So there is this notion of, well, maybe we can create pools of communities that can then get together and buy their own insurance policies. I won't go into too much resilience bonds and sovereign risk transfer, but just suffice to say that there is sort of no end of sort of creative ways that insurers and reinsurers and the capital markets can be brought to help finance some of the risk transfer, but just keeping in mind that really insurance is the last line of defense, and really most of our efforts ought to be placed towards risk avoidance and risk reduction. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I'm going to open it to questions from the audience. I believe we have some people ready to rush to you with microphones, do we? Yes. Raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. And please, if you have a particular speaker in mind, say so, and we'll get the right person answering. All right, well, I have some questions.
One here, I think.
Oh, we did get one? Oh, yes, all right.
Hey, I'm Clinton Johnson, he, him pronouns, racial equity lead for ESRI, geo-equity innovation lead for NAACP. I'm curious about any tools or models that folks are looking at to explore the implications of all the risks that were described today and potential solutions for it, those implications at the intersections of issues like systems of oppression like racism and socioeconomic inequality.
Sure, yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
So sure, certainly I can take that. So when we're building out our models, our risk models, generally we're looking at the sort of the physical environment. So as we're building out the tools, we're really looking at what is the risk as it relates to the built environment and to the natural environment. So whether there's risk of flooding or storm surge, that's really the lens through which the risk is being quantified. In terms of then using those tools can then be used to identify, well, other areas that are disproportionately affected. Certainly the models can be used to do that. And then that could then lead to particular solutions around trying to address that problem. But as we're building the models, we're not using, it doesn't matter to us what is, really what we're mostly concerned about is the property that's on the ground and where is it located. So that's what we're assessing as we are building these models. It's really just the physical information.
Might just quickly add that you could overlay things like history of redlining, socioeconomic indicators of various types, percentage of people who maybe speak English in a community. Right. You know, all those sorts of information would be
yeah, that's
extremely
very
valuable.
commonly done.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. My name is Robert Bullard, and I'd like to know how your models might be able to incorporate, for example, the Center for Disease Control, ATSDR, the Climate Vulnerability Index, which is a cumulative index that that could be useful in terms of identifying where vulnerabilities are located, and then as you build out infrastructure to ensure that that infrastructure does not exacerbate the flooding predictions that are coming. I give an example of highways, and there's billions of dollars being spent in the bipartisan infrastructure law, for example, $1.2 trillion with, I think, upwards of 60–70% of that is highway built infrastructure. And there are predictions that in the next 30 years, flood risk will increase by 25%. But for those communities that have a higher percentage of black people, and I'm speaking particularly in the South, those flood risks are not 25%, but they are 40%. But yet and still, if you model out where states, I'm talking southern states, this is not science, it's political science, are spending their highway monies, a lot of the highways that are being built are bad infrastructure, which is creating flooding. Now, not 25, 30 years from now. So we are spending money that's exacerbating flooding, but not looking at factors of equity, justice, and fairness to correct past mistakes going forward. And I'll give an example, and I'll shut up, of my hometown in Elba, Alabama, that I had not been back home in 55 years. I got a call 6 months ago for me to come home and deal with a highway that was elevated and made into 4 lanes that's now, since 2018, that's flooding a community that has never flooded because it's elevated and because now they've placed the community in a bowl, and now it's becoming a flood zone because of the highway and because of the drainage system is pushing money into water into the area. And black folks have owned land there since Reconstruction, including my family since 1878. But yet and still, money is going and policy is being directed to build highways to get people fast, whatever. So policy must meet the science, and the science must also address the political science. I know you're geographers, you may not be able to deal with that, but
Thank you.
help. Asking for help.
You know, if I might say something in response to that, we've learned a lot of lessons in the West Africa project. One of those lessons, at one level, there's going to require a fundamental readjustment in priorities. Some of these problems are going to take hundreds of billions of dollars. That's the estimate for Africa, in fact. But one of the things we've learned in that project is how important local knowledge is. You saw one of my diagrams showing a family walking across a wooden bridge that has been built. There is an effort now to understand, at least in that area, which I'm most familiar with, what local solutions can save lives now, right now. People are dying. So we can wait for the mega projects, which are going to be important if they take into account the landscapes that you're talking about. But without local input, you're liable to make the mistakes that you've implied, and that's happened in West Africa over and over. I'll give you one more example of that. I'm Canadian. I work with Indigenous communities in Canada. The Inuit and Cree in northern Canada always had very predictable sea ice upon which they could hunt. But every year now, sea ice is unpredictable. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. And so those communities are developing ways in which one hunter can tell others of the conditions in certain routes. Now that may sound trivial to some of you, but that has saved many lives of hunters. And this idea of bringing local, sometimes indigenous, just sometimes local knowledge to bear is going to save lives.